My name is Richard Wells. I'm 76 years old, a widower, and I live alone in the same house in Omaha where I raised my daughter, where my late wife, Caroline, used to hum while watering the gardenias by the kitchen window. The house creaks in the winter and floods a bit in the spring, but it's my anchor, the only place that still remembers who I used to be. I retired 15 years ago from the community college, where I taught literature for nearly 3 decades. I thought retirement would be a time of peace, of books and gardening, of morning walks, and the quiet dignity of growing old. But life had a different script for me, one that starts with silence and ends with a kind of ache that makes your bones feel hollow. I wake up each morning to a heavy quiet, a stillness that no radio can fill. My day begins with the same routine. I boil water on the gas stove, measure out the coffee grounds like Caroline used to, 2.5 scoops, no more, no less, and pour it slowly into her old mug that says "World's Best Teacher" in faded red letters. I make toast, sometimes with jam, sometimes just dry, and I sit by the window that overlooks the street. I watch the mailman, the joggers, the young mothers with strollers, and pretend I'm not invisible to them. I don't mind the solitude, at least not all of it. I can handle being alone. What I can't handle is being erased, like my story, my presence, no longer fits into the lives of the people I once lived for. My daughter Deborah used to call every Sunday evening after church. "How's the old man?" she'd say with a laugh, her voice clipped and efficient, always multitasking. I could hear her typing, sometimes giving instructions to her kids in the background. She's a project manager for a software company, divorced, remarried, and wrapped so tightly in schedules and responsibilities that I started to feel like one more item on her to-do list. Our conversations grew shorter over the years, shifting from warm check-ins to polite formalities. The last time she visited the house, she stood in the living room for less than 10 minutes, looked around like she was assessing property value, and said, "You know, Dad, this place is too big for you now. Maybe it's time to think about options, something more manageable." She meant a retirement home. She didn't say it outright, but it hung there in the air, like the mildew in the basement. I smiled and nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to seem difficult. Caroline always said Deborah was practical, the kind of person who made decisions with a calculator instead of a heart. I see now that she meant it as a warning. Deborah didn't stay for tea. She didn't even sit down. She had a conference call in 15 minutes and traffic to beat. She left with a kiss on the cheek and a perfumed breeze. That was 6 months ago. Since then, our contact has been limited to short texts. "Happy birthday, Dad," or "Hope you're staying warm," that feel more like reminders sent from a calendar app than messages from a daughter. And yet, I still held hope. Hope that she would remember the stories I told her as a child, the long drives to the lake, the way I used to brush her hair when she cried over something silly and small. Hope that she would one day say, "Let's have dinner, just the two of us," and not treat me like a burden to be managed or a liability to be minimized. That fragile hope, stupid as it sounds, is what made me say yes when she called last month and said, "Dad, how would you like to go to Hawaii?" Her voice was bright, rehearsed. She spoke of warm beaches and fresh pineapple, of healing ocean breezes and the whole family together. "It's my treat," she said. "A real vacation for your birthday. You deserve it." I almost dropped the phone. In over a decade, she had never offered anything so kind, so generous. I imagined sandy walks, dinner with the grandkids, laughter. I imagined being included. When I asked her if I should pack anything specific, she said not to worry. "Just bring your ID, a couple changes of clothes, and your meds. I'll take care of the rest. We'll get you some new things there." Something about the way she said it felt odd, rehearsed again, like a line from a brochure. But I told myself not to be paranoid, Maybe she was finally trying to bridge the years between us. Maybe this was her way of making peace with the old man who used to make pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings. Maybe she remembered. For the next few days, I moved around the house with a strange lightness, like I was walking on air. I laid out my best shirts, 2 polos, and a button-down Caroline had bought me 10 Christmases ago. I packed the old leather bag I used when Caroline and I went to Santa Fe that one summer before the diagnosis. I even trimmed my beard and dusted off my straw hat. The night before the trip, I barely slept. I imagined what the kids would say. "Grandpa, I can't believe you're here." I imagined Deborah smiling at me, not out of obligation, but out of love. She picked me up in the morning, just after sunrise. She was wearing sunglasses and had coffee in a cup holder, her car idling in the driveway like it had somewhere better to be. "Hop in, Dad. We're on a tight schedule," she said, and I obeyed. I asked about Carl, her husband. Were they bringing the kids? She said Carl was already at the airport, handling the luggage and checking in. "You know how he is, Mr. Efficient," she joked. I laughed, though I'd never been particularly close with Carl. Something about his eyes always felt like he was sizing me up. The drive to the airport was quiet. Deborah answered a few work calls, laughed politely at things I didn't understand. She barely looked at me. When we arrived, she parked at the departure curb. "Here we are, Terminal B," she said, handing me an envelope with my boarding pass and a printed itinerary. "Just go straight to Gate 17. They'll help you with anything you need." I reached for my suitcase, and she gave me a quick hug, the kind you give to acquaintances, not fathers. "Have fun, Dad. We'll see you soon." And then she was gone. No walk to the gate, no wait to see if I got through security, just the tail lights of her car vanishing into airport traffic. I stood there for a minute, watching the crowd swirl around me. Families laughing, couples holding hands, kids dragging bright backpacks behind them. I looked down at the boarding pass in my hand, expecting to see Honolulu printed in bold letters. Instead, it said Tulsa. One way, no return date. I stared at it, confused at first. Then a chill ran through me, one I hadn't felt since the day Caroline died, and I realized I'd be sleeping alone for the rest of my life. I looked up, searching for Deborah's car, but she was gone. The woman at the airline counter confirmed it. Yes. The ticket was valid. Yes. It was non-refundable, and no, there was no return flight booked. My hands trembled. My legs felt weak. For a moment, I just stood there. An old man with a useless suitcase and an envelope full of betrayal. That's how my story begins. With a boarding pass to nowhere and a daughter who decided her father was no longer part of her life. But what she didn't expect, what no one expected, was that I would come back. And I would come back with more than just anger. I would come back with a plan. I don't remember walking from the airport entrance to the gate. My feet must have moved on their own, guided by habit or sheer disbelief, because my mind was somewhere else entirely, caught in a spiral of questions and slow-forming realizations that began to calcify in my chest. Tulsa. Not Honolulu, not even a layover city. Just Tulsa. A dusty, landlocked town I'd only ever passed through on road trips in the 1970s, and this wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. My daughter had looked me in the eye that very morning and spoken of beaches and coconuts, of sunsets and luau's, of our family finally coming together again. And now I was holding a ticket to a city that had nothing to do with anything she'd promised. I should have turned around right then. I should have walked out, demanded answers, demanded she come back. But I didn't. I sat there at the gate, in one of those cold metal chairs near the window. clutching the envelope like it might still transform into something else if I held it tightly enough. The woman at the gate counter looked at me with vague concern when I asked again if there was any mistake, if perhaps this was just a wrong booking. She clicked through her computer, confirmed my name, and repeated gently that the flight was real, that it was boarding in 40 minutes, and that I was free to change it at my own expense if I wanted, though no refunds would be available for the original fare. Her voice was kind but indifferent, the way you speak to an elderly man who's obviously confused, but not yet disruptive enough to call for assistance. I found a quiet corner near the windows, away from the others waiting to board. I opened the itinerary Deborah had given me, now half wrinkled from my grip, and scanned the paper. There was a hotel address listed in Tulsa, a modest motel near the city's outskirts, a place I recognized as a budget chain. There were no accompanying instructions, no mention of who would meet me, how long I would stay, or what I was supposed to do once I got there. Just an address, a check-in time, and my name. I reached for my phone out of instinct, only to remember that I hadn't brought it. Deborah had insisted. "Take a break from all that, Dad?" she said as I zipped my suitcase closed. "You won't need it where we're going." That had felt almost poetic at the time, a bit of freedom from constant beeping and buzzing. Now it felt ominous. Now it felt like a calculated removal of the only lifeline I had. The flight boarded on time. I don't remember the takeoff, or much of the flight itself. I sat wedged between a teenage boy with headphones and a middle-aged woman who didn't speak English and offered me a bag of crackers. I politely declined. I stared out the window, though there was nothing to see but clouds, and then fields, and then more clouds. I tried to make sense of it all. Why Tulsa? Why at all? My thoughts swung violently between confusion, anger, sadness, and shame. Had Deborah grown so cold, so entirely indifferent to me that this elaborate charade, was her way of getting rid of me? The only answer that kept floating to the surface was the one I didn't want to believe. Yes, somewhere along the line, my daughter had stopped seeing me as her father and started seeing me as a problem. The motel was even worse than I expected. The cab driver, a lanky man with a missing tooth and a nasal twang, dropped me off at dusk without helping me with my bag. "You good?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder as I stood on the cracked pavement, unsure whether to nod or shake my head. I said nothing. He drove off before I could decide. The motel sign blinked erratically, VAC NCY, with half the letters burned out. The lobby smelled of bleach and despair, the kind of place where the carpet was always damp and the vending machine always empty. I handed the clerk the itinerary. He scanned it, barely looked at me, and gave me a key card. Room 114. I dragged my suitcase down the exterior hallway, the wheels bumping over uneven concrete. My room smelled like cigarettes and air freshener. The bedspread was floral, cheap, stained. The lamp flickered when I turned it on. There was a plastic chair, a phone that didn't work, and a television bolted to the dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. For what? I wasn't sure. I waited through the night. At first, I thought perhaps this was part of the surprise, a layover before the real trip, and Deborah would call or appear or send someone. Maybe she had some convoluted plan to recreate a memory or make me appreciate something. Maybe I was being tested. But the hours passed and no one came. I lay awake listening to the hum of the motel ice machine outside my window, the occasional slam of a car door, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. The phone remained dead. No knock came. No message slipped under the door. Morning arrived in the form of thin sunlight through plastic blinds and a distant lawnmower. I hadn't slept. My back ached from the mattress, and my mouth was dry. I went to the lobby to ask if any messages had come for me. The clerk had changed. This one looked barely 20, eyes still glazed from a sleepless shift. He shook his head, uninterested. "Checkout's at 11, he added, as if I were a regular. I stepped outside, blinking in the daylight. My legs felt weak, but I walked. I didn't know where I was going, but anything was better than that room. I walked past fast food restaurants and pawn shops, past a liquor store with bars on the windows. I saw a man sleeping on a bench and wondered if I looked much different. I kept walking until I found a diner. The waitress didn't ask questions when I sat down and ordered a cup of coffee. She just poured, refilled, and left the check face down. I stayed there for hours. I watched people come and go. Construction workers, old couples, truckers, young mothers with sticky children. I thought about Caroline. What would she have said? She would have been furious, of course, but not surprised. She saw something in Deborah that I refused to acknowledge, even back then. "There's a hardness in her, Richard," she once said after a particularly tense holiday dinner. "It's in her eyes, like she's already decided how the story ends, and she won't let anyone else write a line." I told her she was being dramatic. I told her that Deborah just needed time, space, responsibility. But Caroline saw what I didn't. A daughter who had grown resentful of her roots, who wanted a version of family that didn't include the inconvenient presence of aging parents. By the time I returned to the motel, my room key no longer worked. I had to knock until the clerk came and grudgingly let me back in. No messages, no calls, no apologies. I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in my life, I felt something worse than anger or grief. I felt erased. Like a number removed from a ledger, like a photo removed from a frame. I could have died in that room, and no one would have known. Maybe that's what they were counting on. And yet, somewhere in that numbness, a thought began to form. A small, steady thought. I would go back. I didn't know how yet. I had no phone, no way to contact anyone, and I wasn't even sure what money I had access to, but I would go back. I would not die in Tulsa. I would not disappear quietly. I would go back and look my daughter in the eye and ask her, not as a father asking for love, but as a man demanding the truth. What did I ever do to deserve this? And whatever the answer was, I would deal with it. But not from a motel bed in a town that wasn't mine, not from the margins. I may have been old, and I may have been alone, but I wasn't gone. Not yet. I spent the rest of that second day in Tulsa walking, not because I had any particular destination in mind, but because movement seemed to be the only thing keeping my thoughts from turning completely inward and swallowing me whole. I walked until my feet hurt, until my back ached from the weight of the small bag I carried, and until my mouth was dry from the relentless heat that baked the cracked sidewalks and shimmered off the hoods of passing cars. I didn't look like I belonged there. That much was clear. I was overdressed for the weather, underprepared for being alone, and too obviously lost for anyone to mistake me for a local. But no one asked questions. A few people looked my way. Most didn't. I think I could have collapsed on that sidewalk and been stepped over. That was when it first truly hit me. Not just the betrayal, but the erasure. My daughter hadn't sent me here to get away or to rest. She had sent me away to be forgotten. That night I found a small church tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered storefront. The front doors were open, and inside it was cooler, quieter, filled with the scent of old wood and candles. I didn't believe in God in any structured way, not since Caroline passed, but I sat down in one of the pews anyway. An older man in a blue sweater came and sat beside me after a while. He didn't ask what I was doing there, didn't question the suitcase at my feet, or the bewildered look on my face. He just introduced himself as Pastor Leon, said I looked like I needed some water and maybe a sandwich. I followed him to the back, where they had a small kitchen, and he handed me a ham sandwich on white bread and a glass of water without saying another word. We sat in silence, broken only by the sound of the old fridge humming and the occasional creak of the building settling. After I finished eating, he finally asked me what had brought me to Tulsa. I didn't answer directly. I said I had been left behind. That was the phrase I chose. Left behind. He nodded slowly, as though he'd heard those words before, and simply said, "That happens more than people think." He let me sleep in one of the rooms behind the sanctuary, on a cot with a blanket and a pillow that smelled of storage. It wasn't much, but I was grateful beyond words. That night, for the first time since the airport, I felt something other than dread. I felt the stirrings of resolve. In the morning, Pastor Leon offered to let me stay another day or two while I figured things out. He helped me call my bank from the office phone. I explained that I had lost access to my cell phone and needed to verify some account information. The woman on the other end asked me a series of questions. Birth date, mother's maiden name, the last 3 purchases I could remember, and finally confirmed that my account was still active and that there had been no suspicious activity. I nearly cried. At least Deborah hadn't drained it. Yet, I asked if I could get a new debit card sent to a local address. She said it would take 3 to 5 business days. I gave the church's address with Pastor Leon's permission and hung up feeling a little less adrift. The next call was to a nearby branch of the airline. They had a kiosk downtown. I took a bus, using coins Pastor Leon had found in the church office, and explained my situation to a young woman behind the counter. She looked skeptical at first. An old man with no ID, no phone, no concrete return plan. But I had my driver's license in my wallet and the stub from the Tulsa flight. That was enough. She booked me a one-way ticket to Omaha for the next day. The price was steep, nearly $500, but I had enough in my wallet to cover it in cash. I wouldn't have much left afterward, but I didn't care. I just needed to get home. That night I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling of the church room. My fingers curled into the edge of the cot. I kept replaying the moment in the car, just before Deborah dropped me off. The way she had smiled, too wide, too bright. The way she had hugged me with only one arm. The way she had said, "We'll see you soon." A phrase that now echoed with layers of cruelty I hadn't heard before. And I remembered something else. The way she had asked me to leave my phone. How she had packed my bag for me. How she had promised to take care of all the arrangements. It hadn't been kindness. It had been control. She hadn't wanted me reachable, hadn't wanted me to know the details. She had wanted me isolated, useless, forgotten. The flight home was quiet. I sat in a window seat again, but this time I didn't look out. I stared at the seat in front of me, my hands gripping the armrests, my thoughts turning over like a slow, painful machine. What would I do when I got back? My home would still be there, presumably. My accounts were still in my name. But what then? Pretend it didn't happen? Confront Deborah? Try to fix something that had already been broken beyond recognition? By the time we landed, I still didn't know. I took a cab back to my house and paid the driver with the last of my cash. The house was just as I had left it. Quiet, dim, smelling faintly of old books and dust. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my suitcase still in hand, feeling like a ghost. Returned to his former life. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the same spot on the linoleum floor where Caroline used to drop her tea bag every morning without fail. And then I picked up the house phone, the one mounted on the wall like some relic from another time, and I called Deborah. She didn't answer. I left a message. "Deborah, this is your father. I'm back home. We need to talk." I kept it calm, polite, unthreatening. Then I called again an hour later. Still no answer. That night, I checked my mailbox for the first time in a week. Among the flyers and bills was a letter from a lawyer's office. One I didn't recognize. I opened it slowly, my hands already shaking. It was a formal notice. Deborah was filing for guardianship. Of me. I read the letter 3 times. I sat down in the living room with it spread out across my knees, each line hammering into me with renewed force. Due to recent concerns regarding cognitive decline, safety issues, inability to manage personal affairs, she had begun the legal process to have me declared legally incompetent. The Tulsa trip had not been the betrayal. It had been the setup. It was the justification. She had created a situation in which I would seem lost, confused, helpless. A man found in a strange city with no return ticket, no phone, no contact. A perfect case of early dementia, or worse. The reality of it settled over me like a heavy shroud. This wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was about taking everything, my rights, my assets, my home. I didn't sleep that night. I took out every folder, every piece of paperwork Caroline and I had kept through the years. Mortgage documents, bank statements, insurance policies, the deed to the house. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of paper, trying to trace the outlines of the trap that had been laid for me. I found the joint bank account I had opened for Deborah back when she was in college, one we never closed. I saw the monthly transfers I'd been making for years. I saw the financial statements from when I gave her money for her second wedding, for the down payment on their house, for her children's tuition. She had built an entire life on the foundation of my support, and now she wanted the rest of the structure for herself. But she had made a mistake. She had underestimated me. She had thought I would go quietly. She had forgotten that I was still her father, still the man who had once worked 3 jobs to keep our family afloat, still the man who had read legal briefs late into the night when her mother was sick and we were fighting with the insurance company. She had forgotten that I still knew how to fight. The next morning, I made an appointment with Martin Flannery, a lawyer Caroline and I had used years ago when we drafted our wills. He was retired, but his daughter had taken over the practice and agreed to see me. I gathered every document I could find and brought them in a folder. I told her everything, calmly, clearly, methodically. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Mr. Wells, this is serious, but we can fight it. You're going to need to undergo a full medical evaluation to prove capacity, and we'll have to challenge the guardianship filing in court. But it's doable." She handed me a packet of information and started making calls. As I left her office, the sun hit me square in the face. It was blinding, almost too much to bear after days of shadows. But I didn't look away. I lifted my chin, took a deep breath, and kept walking. My daughter had tried to erase me, but I was still here, and now I was writing my own ending. The first appointment was with a geriatric specialist downtown, a kind woman in her 60s named Dr. Helena Marston, who reminded me of Caroline in a way that was almost painful. Her calm, observant manner, the way she tilted her head when she asked questions, the softness in her voice when she said my name. The evaluation was extensive. Memory tests, coordination checks, problem-solving exercises, language and comprehension drills that lasted over 2 hours, all recorded and documented with precision. I answered everything calmly and thoroughly, even when my hands trembled from exhaustion or when my knees ached from sitting too long. I recited names and dates, recalled sequences, interpreted proverbs, and traced complex geometric shapes with shaking fingers. She watched me with a gentle intensity, occasionally nodding or making notes on her clipboard. When it was over, she smiled, the kind of smile that carried no pity, only truth. "Mr. Wells," she said, "there's nothing wrong with your mind. Nothing at all. Those words hit me with such force I nearly wept. Not out of fear or desperation, but out of sheer validation. It wasn't just a medical confirmation. It was a reclamation of something far more personal. My dignity. I hadn't been crazy. I hadn't been delusional. I had been betrayed. 2 more doctors saw me that week, and both reached the same conclusion. No signs of dementia. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Just an aging man with a clear mind and a broken heart. My lawyer compiled their reports, attached sworn affidavits, and filed a formal opposition to Deborah's guardianship petition. She also submitted a motion requesting an emergency injunction to prevent any financial transactions or property claims until the matter was resolved. I watched her move through this legal world with ease and grace, and I realized that while Deborah may have been strategic, she had made a fatal error in underestimating how quickly a wronged man can act once he knows the truth. A week later, I received another letter, this time from Deborah's lawyer. It was slick, full of phrases like, "Our client is concerned and in the best interest of all parties," carefully written to sound reasonable, while still casting me as unstable and confused. What rattled me most wasn't the language, it was the confidence. They clearly believed they had built a case so airtight that my rebuttal would collapse under scrutiny. They had no idea that I'd already returned. No idea that I'd passed the evaluations. No idea that I was already 3 steps ahead of them. That was when I made a decision I hadn't expected. I drove to Deborah's house. It wasn't a spontaneous act. I had rehearsed it a dozen times in my head. But it still felt like stepping onto a battlefield without knowing if the bullets were real. She lived in a newly developed suburb on the west side of town, where all the houses looked vaguely identical and the grass was always trimmed too perfectly. Her driveway was empty. Carl's car was gone too. I rang the doorbell with a trembling hand, unsure if I wanted her to answer. But she did. She opened the door in a soft cardigan and slippers, her hair pinned up, no makeup on. She blinked like she'd seen a ghost. "Dad?" she said, her voice cracking at the edges. "What? How?" "I'm back," I said simply. "You weren't expecting that, were you?" She stared at me, silent for a moment, before stepping aside to let me in. I entered the foyer, noticing immediately how little of me remained in her life. No photos of Caroline, no family pictures with me. Just a sleek, sterile interior that looked like it had been lifted from a catalog. She led me to the kitchen. We sat at a granite island, facing each other like strangers negotiating a truce. I placed the envelope with the medical evaluations in front of her. She didn't touch it. "I know what you did," I said. "Tulsa wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. You sent me there to make me look incompetent. You wanted guardianship so you could take everything." She didn't deny it. Not immediately. She looked down, her hands clasped tightly together, and said, "I was worried about you." "No," I said sharply. "You were worried about the money, about the house, about what would happen if I lived too long and you didn't get what you think you're owed." She flinched just slightly, and then her face hardened. "You don't understand what it's like, Dad. I've been carrying this family for years. Carl lost his job last year and didn't tell anyone. The kids' tuition, the mortgage, the medical bills. You think we're swimming in money, but we're drowning." "So you decided to let me drown instead?" I asked. "You decided I was worth more as a silent signature than as a living person?" Her eyes welled with tears, but I didn't move. I didn't reach out. Not this time. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered. "But you did," I said. "You didn't just hurt me. You buried me. And now you're going to find out that I don't stay buried." I stood to leave, but she grabbed my wrist. "Please, don't do this. We can fix this." "No," I said. "We can't. You tried to erase me. You almost succeeded. But you forgot one thing, Deborah. Memories aren't proof of weakness. They're proof I've lived long enough to know who I am." She let go. I walked out. I didn't look back. That night, back in my house, I sat at Caroline's old writing desk and began drafting something I never thought I'd need. A new will. One that made sure Deborah received nothing. I named a foundation in Caroline's honor as the sole beneficiary. I called my lawyer the next morning to make it official. It was petty, maybe, but it felt like justice. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have guessed, was that Deborah had already anticipated this move. 2 days later, her lawyer filed a counter motion, now including a notarized statement from a friend of the family, who claimed I had shown signs of paranoia and forgetfulness for months. The friend was Carl, my son-in-law, a man who had once cried at Caroline's funeral, and now was helping forge a narrative in which I was mentally deteriorating. It hit like a fist to the chest. But even that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came in the form of a single voicemail from Deborah that evening. "I didn't want it to be like this, Dad, but if you keep pushing, I'm going to have to tell the court everything. About the stove incident, about the whiskey bottle, about the time you got lost driving to the doctor's office. I'm sorry, but you're leaving me no choice." All of it was lies. Half-truths twisted into weapons. I'd never touched whiskey in years. The stove incident never happened. And the one time I got lost, it was because construction had blocked the street. Not because I forgot where I was. But in her voice, I heard something new. Not fear, not guilt, just certainty. She believed she could rewrite the past and that no one would question her version, but she was wrong. I didn't erase the voicemail. I saved it. I copied it. I gave it to my lawyer. I began gathering every letter, every statement, every financial record that showed a pattern of extraction, from my accounts to hers. I went through my old journals, my calendars, even my grocery receipts. I built a timeline. I documented everything, because the truth isn't just something you feel in your gut. It's something you can prove, line by line. That's when it stopped being about revenge. It became something else, something deeper. I wasn't fighting to punish my daughter. I was fighting to exist, to not be turned into a caricature of old age, to remind the world and myself that my story wasn't over. And no matter what they said, no matter what papers they filed or lies they told, I would finish it on my terms, even if I had to burn every bridge to do it. The days that followed were unlike anything I'd ever lived through. Not even in the worst days after Caroline's death. Not even during the long, sleepless nights of her illness, when I would sit by the hospital window watching dawn seep through the blinds with the dull understanding that I might be witnessing her last sunrise. This was different. This was war. Not a loud, dramatic war with shouting and slammed doors, but the quiet, insidious kind. The kind fought with legal motions, forged documents, insinuations whispered in court corridors, and character assassination carried out in conference rooms by people who used to kiss you on the cheek and call you Dad. Every morning I rose with a strange mixture of dread and determination, pulling myself into my clothes like armor, reviewing timelines, rechecking paperwork, collecting receipts, medical, reports, bank statements, phone records, anything that might help prove what had really happened, that I was neither senile nor paranoid, that I had not lost my way, but had in fact been strategically displaced and made to look like I had. My lawyer, Amanda Royce, was a quiet woman in her 40s, with a mind like a trap, and a temperament forged from years in probate litigation. She didn't waste words. She didn't soothe. She fought. Every time I brought her something, an old checkbook with annotated notes, a birthday card from Deborah that casually mentioned how sharp I was for my age, a voicemail where Carl referred to me as completely lucid, she nodded with that same tight smile and said, "That helps." Over time, she assembled a case so airtight it could suffocate the lies trying to slither into court. Still, the pressure mounted. Deborah wasn't backing down. If anything, she was doubling down, submitting additional declarations from her friends, from a neighbor who once saw me watering plants at night and called it erratic behavior, from a pharmacist who remembered me asking for clarification on dosage, instructions, and found it concerning for someone his age. The world, it seemed, was more than willing to believe I was losing it. One afternoon, I received a subpoena to appear for an independent evaluation by a court-appointed psychiatrist, someone selected by Deborah's legal team. Amanda warned me it was a trap. "They want to catch you off guard," she said, "to make you emotional, confused, easily rattled." I arrived at the office early, dressed in my best shirt and slacks, Caroline's old watch on my wrist like a charm. The psychiatrist, a pale man in his 60s with eyes that never quite made contact, asked me a series of questions meant to provoke, to disorient, to lead me into contradictory statements. But I answered slowly, precisely. When he asked me the date, I not only gave it, but reminded him it was the anniversary of the moon landing. When he asked me who the president was, I told him, and then gave him the names of the last 4 presidents in reverse order. When he asked me how I spent my days, I told him about my reading habits, my walks through the park, my morning crossword puzzles. I watched his pen hesitate. I saw him shift in his seat. He wasn't getting what he wanted, and that gave me strength. When it was over, he handed me a clipboard to sign, and I looked him in the eye for the first time and said, "I may be old, but I'm not gone. Remember that." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. Back home, I found the mailbox stuffed with flyers and legal notices. One in particular caught my eye. A letter from my bank informing me that Deborah had attempted to gain access to one of my investment accounts, citing her pending guardianship petition. The request had been denied, but the very fact that she had tried shook me to the core. I wasn't just fighting for my autonomy. I was fighting for my very survival. That night, I sat at the dining table, surrounded by the life I had built piece by piece, and realized just how much of it she had tried to dismantle. It was never about concern. It was about conquest. She wanted the house. She wanted the money. She wanted the silence. She wanted a version of the future where I was neatly stored away like a broken heirloom, too burdensome to display, but too valuable to discard. I couldn't allow that. I wouldn't. The next escalation came in the form of a surprise home visit. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I heard the knock. I opened the door to find a social worker and a uniformed officer standing on my porch. "We received a wellness request," the woman said. "Someone was concerned about your living situation." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "You mean my daughter?" I said. "Yes," she admitted. "Do you mind if we take a look around?" I wanted to slam the door. I wanted to scream. But Amanda had warned me. Never refuse. Always cooperate. Let them see. So I let them in. I showed them the pantry, stocked with food. The medication cabinet, neatly organized. The refrigerator, full of labeled containers. My calendar on the wall, marked with appointments. My bookshelves. My passwords notebook. My copies of every legal document. My journals. My filing system. My typed emergency contacts. I showed them everything. By the time they left, the social worker looked almost embarrassed. "You seem very self-sufficient," she said. "I've had to be," I replied. "People have tried to take that from me." A few days later, Amanda received an email from Deborah's attorney suggesting a settlement, a compromise, where guardianship would be dropped in exchange for joint power of attorney, a monthly stipend from my accounts to assist with medical and household concerns, and a mutual non-disparagement clause. In other words, sign over the money quietly, agree not to speak publicly about what had happened, and she would let me live in peace. I told Amanda to reject it without hesitation. "I'm not interested in peace built on lies," I said. "I want the truth, on record, in court, for everyone to see." She nodded. "Good," she said, "because they're getting desperate, and that's when people make mistakes." And make mistakes they did. One morning, Amanda called me with urgency in her voice. "They filed new documents last night. Statements from your doctor." My heart dropped. "What doctor?" I asked. "Exactly," she said. "The name on the form is real, but the signature isn't. And the address is a private clinic that shut down 3 years ago." It was forgery. Brazen, reckless, and criminal. Amanda filed a motion to dismiss the guardianship entirely based on fraudulent evidence. We submitted the forensic analysis of the signature. The court scheduled a hearing within 10 days. Those 10 days were the longest of my life. I barely ate. I barely slept. I kept going over every conversation with Deborah, every moment where I had looked the other way, every warning Caroline had given me, and I had ignored. And then I thought about something else. Something Amanda had said early on, almost offhand. "They're not just trying to win, they're trying to rewrite who you are." That stayed with me, because it was true. Deborah wasn't just trying to take control. She was trying to erase the version of me that had raised her, protected her, believed in her. She wanted a different narrative. The old man who got confused in airports, who couldn't remember his pills, who needed to be rescued from himself. And I realized then that this wasn't just about me. It was about every man and woman who had grown old and been discarded. Every elder whose life story had been reduced to a medical file or a probate case. I had to stand not just for myself, but for all of us. For everyone who had been told, quietly or loudly, that they were no longer necessary. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in my best suit. Caroline had picked it out years ago for our anniversary dinner at the old seafood restaurant that's now a pharmacy. It still fit, barely. I wore her wedding ring on a chain under my shirt. I arrived early, sat quietly in the courtroom, and waited. Deborah walked in with Carl. She looked thinner, more drawn, her face etched with tension. Carl avoided my eyes. Their lawyer looked grim. Amanda sat beside me and whispered, "You ready?" I nodded. "Let's finish this." What followed was 6 hours of testimony, cross-examination, document review, expert analysis, and procedural chaos. At one point, the judge stopped everything to ask, "Why are we even here? This man is clearly competent." But still, he let it continue. Because due process matters even when the facts are obvious. When the ruling came, it was swift and absolute. The guardianship was denied. All related claims were dismissed. The court found evidence of bad faith and referred the matter for further review, possibly criminal. I sat there, stunned, as the judge looked directly at Deborah and said, "You have not only failed to prove your case, you have caused considerable harm to your father. This court is deeply concerned by your actions." I left the courtroom and walked into the sunlight, feeling like I had been underwater for months and was only now breathing real air again. People passed me on the sidewalk, unaware of what had just transpired, of the war that had been fought and won, not with fists, but with facts. Back at home, I sat at my desk and wrote a letter. It wasn't a letter of forgiveness or rage. It was a letter of truth. I wrote it to Caroline. I told her everything. About Deborah. About the court. About how close I had come to vanishing. And how I had come back. I sealed it and placed it in her old jewelry box. The one with the little ballerina that no longer danced. It felt like closing a circle. And I knew, for the first time in a long time, that I was still whole. Damaged, maybe, but whole. The world hadn't taken that from me, and it never would. In the days after the court ruling, I didn't feel victorious in the way I had imagined during those endless nights staring at the ceiling and wondering if I would ever be believed. There was no fist raised in triumph, no grand speech or wave of applause. What I felt was something quieter, something far more profound. The slow, dignified return of my name to my own mouth. The reclamation of my own story, not as told by others, not distorted through court filings or whispered slander, but as I had lived it, flawed, stubborn, aging, yes, but lucid and real and undeniably mine. I no longer walked through my house like a ghost. I touched the walls with the reverence of someone who had almost lost everything, ran my fingers along the bookshelf Caroline once organized by theme and not alphabet, poured myself a cup of coffee in her chipped mug, and stood on the porch, listening to the birds without wondering if someone was watching, evaluating, planning to lock me away. The chains had been lifted, but the bruises remained, invisible and deep. A truth I could not share with anyone who hadn't known what it meant to be methodically disassembled by your own flesh and blood. I had stopped calling Deborah. She hadn't called me either. The silence between us was no longer filled with potential or hope. It was thick with finality. And yet, there was still one piece left unresolved. One thing that I had carried like a stone in my pocket since the day I returned from Tulsa. I had not yet told the truth publicly. The legal victory was official, yes, but the story remained private, hidden behind court seals and privileged documents. The world still believed I was simply an old man who had filed some bitter lawsuit against his daughter. They didn't know the truth. And something inside me could no longer tolerate that. I made the decision one evening while sorting through Caroline's things. I found a cassette recorder, yes, a real one, from the 90s, tucked away in a shoebox labeled Memories. Inside were tapes of our daughter's school plays, our anniversary dinners, Caroline's voice reading poems she'd written late at night when she couldn't sleep, and among them, one unlabeled tape. When I played it, my knees nearly buckled. It was a recording I had accidentally made on the day Deborah dropped me off at the airport. My phone, in my jacket pocket, had begun recording without me noticing. I had thought she took my phone entirely, but she had just powered it off after I went through security. When I returned, I had tossed the phone aside and never thought to check. But there it was. The drive to the airport, the casual remarks, the silence in between. And then, just before we reached the curb, her voice, low and tense, speaking to someone on the phone, using her Bluetooth headset. He doesn't suspect anything. He thinks it's a vacation. Tulsa's booked. Motels confirmed. After that, we'll file. I told him not to bring his phone so he can't contact anyone. It's perfect. Just get the paperwork ready. We'll be able to show the court he's wandering, confused, abandoned. After that, the house is ours. He won't even see it coming. Those words, preserved by chance, now sat in my hands like a weapon. Not just proof, but confession. I listened to it again and again until I had every syllable memorized. The cadence of her voice, the chilling calculation in her tone. It wasn't the voice of a daughter. It was the voice of a predator. The next morning, I called Amanda. I asked her what it would mean if this tape were submitted to the State Elder Abuse Review Board. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "It would trigger a full investigation. They'll subpoena everything, communications, financial records, witness statements, and if they find what I think they'll find, your daughter could face criminal charges. This isn't just unethical, it's illegal." I asked if it was too late. She said it wasn't, that we still had options, that justice didn't end with the court ruling. It could still unfold in full. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat in silence for nearly an hour. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't crying. I was remembering the way Deborah had once crawled into bed with Caroline and me after a nightmare, the way she had stood in our kitchen at 12 years old, proud of a B+ on a science test, the way she had held Caroline's hand in the hospital room and whispered, "I'll take care of him. I promise." And then I remembered Tulsa, the motel, the silence, the letter from the lawyer, the lies, the forged signatures, the police on my doorstep. I took the cassette tape and placed it in a padded envelope with a copy of my affidavit and a notarized statement. I mailed it that afternoon to the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services. I did not write a return address. 2 weeks later, an investigator contacted me. The man's voice was calm and deliberate. He explained that the audio had been verified and that formal proceedings were beginning. He thanked me for my courage. I thanked him for listening. I didn't ask for updates. I didn't want them. I had done what needed to be done. What happened next was no longer my burden. But something else happened that I didn't expect. A week after the investigator's call, I received a package in the mail. No note, no sender. Inside was a silver picture frame, the one from Deborah's hallway that used to hold a photo of me and Caroline on our wedding day. It was empty, just the frame. At first I didn't understand. Then I realized it was a message, a threat, or maybe a plea, a reminder of what was now broken beyond repair. I placed the frame in my desk drawer. I didn't throw it out. I didn't hang it up. I kept it as it was, hollow. And then, for the first time since all of this began, I cried. Not quietly, not stoically. I cried like a man whose heart had finally been cracked in the place he'd been guarding most. Not because I had lost, but because I had won. And in winning, confirmed what I had feared most. That the person I had loved and protected and believed in, the person I had lifted and carried and forgiven again and again, had never really seen me as anything but useful. And when I ceased to be that, she had put me down. Efficiently, without a second thought. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the lights low and Caroline's ring beside my hand. I spoke aloud, not to her spirit or to the silence, but to the memory of her wisdom. "You were right," I said. "You saw it before I did. You warned me, and I failed to believe you, but I see it now. I see it all, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." In the morning, I made a final call to my lawyer. I asked her to prepare 2 documents. The first was a revised trust that placed all my assets, home, savings, investments, into the hands of an elder support foundation. The second was a personal letter of testimony to be included in the state's case file, not to seek revenge, not to punish, but to record, to ensure the truth in my voice was preserved. She agreed, and within days, it was done. I stood on my front porch after signing those papers and looked out at the neighborhood I had lived in for 40 years. The trees were beginning to turn, the air thinning with the early warning of fall. Across the street, a child I didn't know waved at me. I waved back. I didn't know what tomorrow held, but I knew what today meant. Today, I had reclaimed my life. Not from time, not from death, but from the very people who had tried to write me out of my own story. That was the climax, not in thunder, but in truth. And from that point on, I no longer lived in fear. The months that followed passed with a strange stillness, a kind of hush that settles over the world after a long storm, not because everything is healed, but because the noise has finally stopped. I found myself moving more slowly, not from age, but from the gravity of what had unfolded, the sheer weight of betrayal and justice, and the silence that now filled the space where my daughter's voice used to be. The state investigation went forward, but I kept my distance. I received periodic letters confirming receipt of documents, brief updates about subpoenas and testimony, quiet acknowledgments that the wheels were turning and the truth was being pursued beyond my hands. I had no desire for vengeance anymore. The feeling had burned itself out, leaving behind something harder and colder, clarity. I no longer hoped for apology. I no longer waited for redemption. I understood something now that I hadn't wanted to believe before. Some fractures cannot be mended, and not all losses come with mourning. Some arrive wrapped in smiles and promises, and only when they've passed through you do you see what they've taken. I resumed my life not as it was before, but in a new rhythm. I went to the library twice a week. I joined a small community group of retired educators who met to discuss poetry and current events. I began volunteering at a local food pantry, stocking shelves, and helping elderly clients fill out forms they didn't understand. These things did not erase the pain, but they gave me shape again, gave my days a texture and a sound beyond silence. I kept Caroline's garden alive, trimming the rose bushes and humming the same hymns she once sang under her breath. I even brought the cassette recorder out again, not to record anyone else, but to speak. I spoke my days into tape, what I saw, what I remembered, what I wanted to say when there was no one left to say it to. It wasn't for evidence anymore. It was for permanence. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after the hearing, I received a letter from Deborah. It was handwritten, not typed, and I knew before I opened it that it would not contain what I once would have begged for. I sat at the kitchen table and read each word carefully, as though it might combust in my hands. She wrote that she regretted how things had turned out, not what she had done, but the outcome. She said the investigation had taken a toll on her family, that Carl had been let go from his new position due to the public nature of the inquiry, that the children were asking questions. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't confess, but she asked in quiet, ambiguous phrasing if there might be a way to rebuild. I folded the letter once, then twice, then slid it into the back of the drawer where I kept Caroline's ballerina box. I didn't write back. In the winter, I turned 77. I didn't throw a party. I didn't receive any calls from Deborah. But I did receive a card from the granddaughter I hadn't seen since she was 10. Inside, she had written, "Grandpa, I don't know everything, but I hope one day we can talk. I remember your pancakes. I still dream about them." I held that card in my hand for a long time. A long, long time. It was the only thing in months that made my eyes burn again. I updated my will one final time. I left a letter for my granddaughter. Not instructions, not conditions, just my voice, my side of the story, my love, and my hope that she would live a life where no one ever made her feel expendable. I kept the house. I kept my name. I kept the truth. And in the quiet of that winter evening, as snow blanketed the porch and the wind rattled the window panes, I sat in my armchair, Caroline's Afghan over my knees, and felt something I had not felt in years. Not joy, not peace, but steadiness. I was still here, and that mattered. Because in a world where people are discarded, erased, and rewritten, simply surviving with your truth intact is the greatest act of defiance there is. I didn't vanish. I didn't surrender. I came back. And I stayed